Ready? All right, call the meeting to order. Any public comments? Any public comments? Any public comments? Hearing none, we have approval for the minutes, December 15th.
I move approval. Second.
Motion made and second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carried. Approve agenda.
And we have an amended agenda that was sent out.
And that's just the 319 portion
Right,
of
what
it.
was added was Jeff's presentation and then his report. And that was at the end of the agenda.
I'll move to approve the amended agenda.
Second.
Moved and second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
I'm sorry, who first and second?
Steve and Bob.
Okay.
All right, board reports. Matt.
Oh, consent items?
Oh, we got a consent. Sorry, I just checked off the second one. Consent item, sorry.
And the consent items are the amended list that I sent out. And it has, what I added, I made an error in the Winona County. I didn't include the mileage from what I sent out earlier. And then also, but basically we have the last U of M invoice was added, and then the bills payable, and I think what else is in there. But I added two items that were not in the earlier one. But that's the amended ones we have.
Any discussion? Motion approved.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Looking for Sheila to catch up here.
Yeah.
Got her?
Yep.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. 6, board reports.
I don't have anything.
Not specific, I guess.
Not a whole lot, just starting the new year. We got into an interesting discussion of election options for soil and water districts, but that's about it.
Options for election?
Well, there was a memo that got sent out from some state agency, I think, and just that apparently there's two ways that you can organize soil and water districts. One's by essentially geographical representation, and then another way is by population representation.
As far as the candidates go? Or?
As far as the divisions of the districts.
Wow, I didn't even hear anything about that I can recall.
Yeah, that's new to me.
Yeah, well, Skip did a little research on that, and I guess it goes back to 70s, 80s. The issue first came up, and these two options were established.
Interesting.
Not a lot, pretty quiet, I think, election coming.
Steve?
Yeah, so since our last meeting, I think just prior to our last meeting, we had an MPCA WinLAC chloride monitoring grant come before our board, and it included a vaccine mandate. And Commissioner Ward and myself thought it was inappropriate that that vaccine mandate was included in the grant. So our county attorney agreed with us and wanted time to work on that. So it came back to our board a second time, and by the time it came back around the next time, the MPCA pulled it from Winona County and took the grant to Wabasha County to get approval through Wabasha County SWCD. And so I guess my bigger concerns is not that I have concerns with the grant or what they're doing, but it kind of highlights some of the issues that I had with the whole WinLAC process to begin with. So then I asked Sheila, will they be actually monitoring in Winona County? And your answer was yes. So through blurred governmental boundaries, this used to would have been, before WinLAC, this would have been either Winona County or Winona County SWCD, and we would have had control of our boundaries. So now the MPCA goes to Wabasha, gets the approval through Wabasha SWCD to do the monitoring in Winona County, and our board, it's just, we don't have anything to say about it. So I don't feel good about that process at all.
I could add a little bit yes, that there are sites in Winona County that are being monitored. And when we were first developing the work plan and what needed to be done as far as the chloride, we identified for many months now that was one data gap that we have for this watershed is what are the impacts of chloride from road salt, for example. And
any
we
issues
needed to
there.
do a baseline. So when that was coming forward with the watershed fundings that were coming through the MPCA, doing that monitoring during the winter time, so there was a time issue. But as far as monitoring in Winona County, at the time that we were trying to devise this, yes, it would have made sense for somebody from Winona County to do those sites in Winona County, but we just didn't have the capacity to do that. In the planning department, we're short-staffed, and then the SWCD is down to 2. There was no way that they or we could have picked that up. But River SWCD and Wabasha County SWCD did have the capacity to do so. So it was just that's how that came about. It wasn't that they took it from us, but we just did not have the capacity to do it this winter.
Yeah, I have no concerns about what is being done. My concern is one level of government being able to circumvent another level of government, and all the pieces that we've been putting in place with this WinLAC. It's a new set of governmental boundaries, and it falls completely outside of traditional county lines, state lines, and it is another level of government. And that's something that I've been opposed to right from the start, and here's proof positive in a very small way that this is an example of other things that could happen that we will have little control over. If the larger level of government comes through and says they're going to do something, they'll just go around your county, and they'll have the authority to do so.
I'm going to try to respond to this.
Sure.
I have to say that I respect your opinion, and everyone on this board or whatever has been very good about keeping things logical and so forth. Okay. The way I look at it is I was elected to do a job, which is, of course, try to take care of the soil and water. So when the situation happened that it looked like it might hold up that work, that's why I willingly agreed to go ahead and go forward with it. So that explains that part. As far as the other part, this is like personal, maybe more so opinion, so don't tie it to the soil and water, but almost 72% of the people in Wabasha County are fully vaccinated. So as far as the vaccine part, I feel like I've got a mandate or an okay from my voters that that shouldn't really be an issue. And from another perspective even, the government spent billions of dollars to invest into vaccine and having people get it for free and so forth. But then there's also subsidies for health care and whatever. So elected officials just like us made the decision that they thought they'd mediate the cost of the COVID thing by having vaccine. So if someone chooses not to have vaccine, I think that would be perfect. Except then if they did happen to end up in ICU and have a huge bill and couldn't pay it, then again it would be coming. So just from a cold-hearted business perspective, then I think, well, if we've got an option that the majority thinks they should go with, certainly someone would be free to not take the vaccine. In fact, I never took the flu vaccine in my life as far as before because I had to pay for it and whatever, and I made that choice. Now health insurance, you think the actuaries, if there was a difference in risk, they might change the premiums or something, but maybe that's all down the road. So not to muddy the waters too much, I feel the majority of people think the vaccine idea is okay. So that's why, even though I certainly understand your position and even have belief in that, that's why we decided to go ahead and take that project and try to do it.
Yeah, so to me, it's not the vaccine, that's not the issue. Although, I mean, I'm opposed to that being in there, I wouldn't have pulled it to begin with. But it's an example of, if the MPCA wants to do something in Matt Flynn's county, they can go to Crescent and get approval down there to do what they want in your county. That's the issue to me. So, this is just this is a small example of things that I could see that could go much further awry in the future. So it's not, I don't have in this case, they used Wabasha County SWCD to approve work done in Winona County because they couldn't get Winona County Board to act fast enough. So those are my concerns.
I'm not even sure if I know the answer to this, but like for state gas tax and stuff, do the counties have a say if the gas tax is?
Well, that's a state issue. That's state boundaries.
Yeah, so like Minnesota Pollution Control and whatever is a state agency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those things, so.
There's different boundaries. So there's township boundaries, and there's township government. There's county boundaries, there's county government. There's state boundaries, there's state government, and there's federal boundaries, and there's federal government. Now there's this new level of government called watershed, and it has governmental authority. And it's blurring lines that didn't used to exist. It's making new lines that didn't used to exist. And that's been a concern of mine from day one. That's been my resistance to it. This is just a small example of something that I think we could see things. I feel it empowers the government and takes power away from the citizenry. That's been my beef with it.
Well, it's a good point, except that water doesn't really stop at certain boundaries.
That's the theory. But we used to deal with it with the county boundary SWCDs before that, before the 1-1 program. That's all I have.
Yeah, I'll touch on that a little bit too. And again, I didn't get on this board because I don't care. For 20 years, I've been running around trying to teach farmers and now ag retailers about fertilizer and the right types and how not to pollute the groundwater and use it more efficiently, all those types of things. So I'm all about this, but it scares me a little bit with this chloride testing because I see it as another mode of action, and I just want to lay out a hypothetical that I think eventually is going to tie back to the farmer. Chloride, today we're talking chloride perhaps on salts for road salt, but the reality of it is the majority of what we do, salts in manure, salts in fertilizer, salts in chemicals, salts in water, salts in different things that I think an average landowner or farmer particularly uses on a daily basis. Is this just a backdoor approach to start targeting those types of things? Because at the end of the day, what I see is pockets being created with these duismas for nitrogen, and now we're going to start figuring out how to fill in the holes with chloride, and eventually all the holes are going to start getting filled. And to me, it's just a matter of time before they go back to the farmers and say, well, your manure has salt, this has salt, that fertilizer has salt. I'm a low salt guy to begin with, and fertilizers, I preach that. I can explain the chemistry, I can explain the biological reactions, efficiencies, all those things. what I've done for many years. And in one way, I'm kind of pleased because I think it's going to actually help agriculture. But at the same time, am I seeing in my head, just like with the nitrogen thing, another backdoor approach to start going after farmers? Because when we identify high chloride, how are we going to deal with it? And if I took a common consensus of people, they're not going to want to get rid of road salt because they're going to want so they're going to pick on something else. And what's left to pick on? It's going to be agriculture. And is this just another means to go after ag? So being on both sides of the fence and preached for many, many years using lower salt fertilizers, I'm just saying, I see this coming in the next 10, 20 years, that manure has salts in it, all are chemicals. Salts are a nutrient, something on the periodic table of elements, they're all salts. So what is really the whole point to this chloride thing? Are we really worried about road salt, or is this just another approach to start going after the farmer? And so that is my thinking, is that we're trying to fill in the circles and eventually say, look, we've got different problems, different things, and this kind of backdoor approach to going after agriculture. And so although I think it's great, I think people need to know, I think it's just another one of these, and this is where I have to agree with Steve with this whole blurring the lines. Sometimes what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and sometimes it isn't. So oftentimes in government, we pigeonhole everybody into the same group, and this muddying the lines and saying, well, we're starting to close in enough gaps, so now everybody falls under the same blanket. And local government loses control to what's happening in their area, even if they don't necessarily have a problem. But they get thrown in the box. And so then everybody has to start doing it. And this is what I'm seeing, and this is part of why I got on these boards, is to try to make sense of it and to try to educate farmers and educate back to other people what I know about agriculture, what I know about reducing nitrogen, but yet still being profitable is in the agronomy sector for farmers, and how can we work together. So I'm more scared with this chloride production that this is another backdoor attempt to go after the farmer. Now I think it could be a good thing, because it could definitely help, because I believe, probably the biggest advocate of nitrogen reduction sitting in the room, which is why I've spent a large amount of my career studying it. I just want to make that point clear. And maybe in 10, 20 years, there's going to be a big I told you so. I don't know. We'll see. But I believe the same thing is happening in the nitrogen world too. We're picking on the rise. And it's like the buffer law. I was in northern Minnesota on Monday and Tuesday and brought that up. I said, this buffer law thing, because there's a lot of light soil up there. And we were talking nitrogen management. And I said, the buffer law was an easy one, guys. What's coming down the pipeline is going to get a lot harder. And a lot of that discussion stems from Europe, because of what Europe did, and why some of these innovative new things in the marketplace are mainstay in other parts of the world because of regulation. And I keep telling people, look, learn to adapt now, because it's coming, and whether you like it or not. And so the people that are adaptive to those types of things are moving very quickly, and the people that are hesitant are saying, well, I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. So that leads me to part two. 2 months ago when I was here, I was talking about some of these really new, I guess if you want to call them technologies, but really they're just a version of something genetically modified or natural strains of bugs. The unbelievable response in the countryside. I've been in Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, northern Minnesota, Dakotas, western Minnesota, Nebraska. I had a guy drive from Nebraska all the way up to here, one guy, just to sit down to explain Pivot Bio and Vita, Nutrition, these N reduction bacteria that are out here, because he had heard that we were the experts. Well, whether we are or not, it doesn't make a difference. But he drove all the way up here to sit down for 6 hours and go through it and really understand it. And this thing is, I've never seen anything in agronomy so thirsty for knowledge about these things, and I'm sure the high nitrogen prices are driving that. But the reality of it is there is a lot of merit to these things, and it will change agriculture. And this year has just been, I've never seen a single set or a group of things in agriculture have so much push, drive, and desire behind it, and it's really exciting because these things work, and you just got to figure out how to do it. And so that is a very good thing. It is phenomenal because I really do think it's going to help with nitrogen management, nitrogen reduction in our water, and it's going to give farmers another economical tool to be profitable. So that's what I have. I just wanted to update it and say, 2 months ago was one thing, but to see it happen, and I look at March, my whole March and our company's March is all about that. We have meetings scattered all throughout the Midwest that we have to go to, and that's pretty exciting, guys, that landowners and farmers are really opening up to this thing, and they really want to know, how do these things work? So it's kind of cool. So anyway, those are my 2 points. So any other discussion on board reports? All right, board discussion and action items. Election of officers.
I nominate Gotch, chairperson.
Second?
Any discussion?
No.
I
No.
think you have to ask for other nominations.
What's that?
I think you do need to ask for other
Yeah,
nominations.
we got it. What's that?
I think you should ask for other nominations.
Yeah. Is there any other nominations? Hearing none, I guess all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Any other, I guess we could probably do
Vice
just any
chair.
other chair. Do we want to do each one, or do we want to do it as a
Yeah.
whole, leave it the same?
Chair and then the vice chair.
Okay, so we'll do it down on as vice chair.
I'll nominate Lynn Zabel for vice chair.
I'll second it. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Secretary treasurer, I guess.
Yeah.
Yep. I nominate Bob.
Second?
Who seconded?
Steve.
It's a flip of the coin. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. I think that's it.
No, we have an alternate.
Oh, yeah, we have
Secretary
alternates.
treasurer, which is James right now.
Yep.
Nominate James.
Second?
Nominated and second. Any discussion?
Who seconded?
Lynn did.
Okay.
Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Is that it? Is that all four?
And thank you, that'll make things much easier with the bank.
Yeah. And signing cards.
I don't have to do any.
All right. Okay, financial update. Sheila.
Yeah. Yes, we have, from, at the end of 2021 to December, after drinking water protection grant funds were taken out, we had a balance of $84,251, and for January, that bumped up a bit to $93,005, and that was because we had received some of the funds from reports that I submitted.
So is that all our payments on those cover crop incentives, or we're,
There is one more that I'm waiting on, and I'm not sure if he did it or not. But I don't have the paperwork, so I can't do it, and that was with Olmsted County. And so if it's not something that he's gonna fix, then I'll move that funds somewhere else. But otherwise, with the one exception, it is done.
so we won't see that again until, because we just pay those once a year, right?
Whenever the paperwork gets
Whenever
here.
we were, okay. I'm just curious. All right, anything else, Sheila?
No, that should be it.
Any discussion? So moving on, Whitewater 319 nitrogen reduction grant. Ray Archuleta. So that was a conversation that Sheila called me on, and probably not much to Sheila's liking. I tried to do it the right way, which was,
Yeah,
I just said, look, I don't have sole authority to make a decision to say yes or no. So the only thing we can do is not call a meeting. If we don't want to call a meeting and not have a quorum, you can have an open discussion with the individual and get a common consensus. Kind of like asking for, permission beforehand without actually approving it. And I said, then we'll just they're gonna have to understand that we have to follow procedure. Then we can't do what's happened in the past where we stamp something and then come back and discuss it, yes or no. So that was my recommendation to Sheila, was to just simply say, hey, look, whether we want our name on it or not, this really comes down to how do we look at this. Steve, I know, brought up a good point. I brought up the same point about making sure we don't hook ourselves to any other groups. So there was a background discussion and just making sure we did this the right way. So what came about of that?
So what I did is I did cut a check for $500 that could be considered today to send. The event was yesterday. Lynn was there, and it was very well attended. I was just there just for the morning, and Ray Archuleta, he is an outstanding presenter, I think. Yeah, so it went well. A lot of people there. I know that Wabasha County SWCD contributed $500. Olmsted, that was from their 319 grant, and Olmsted from their soil health farm did $500. So that's why I just did it. I cut a check for $500, assuming that would make sense, because that seemed to match. I know MPCA provided some, and I don't know what. I know it was like 50% of it.
Well, I asked you how much you were thinking,
Yeah,
and that's what
yeah.
you told me.
Yes.
Because I thought you were initially asking for $4,500.
No.
Oh, is that all?
Oh, yeah, we got it.
Just write a check.
But yes, we do have in the 319 grant to support educational initiatives, especially if they're tied with soil health and cover crops, which that event was. So it fit perfectly the guidance from that grant. And so anyway, that was my proposal, that we could pull it through the 319 grant and be able to support at the same level that Wabasha County and Olmsted SWC were able to do it. So I need a motion to approve
Yep.
that.
So moved.
Any discussion? We got a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion made second. All those in favor, any other discussion? All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. You caught it's Bob and James.
I'll get that.
March 10th, workshop for grant participants updates.
Yeah, and this is something I brought up and discussed earlier, and this is the same grant again. Angela White at Olmsted is working on a March 10th workshop for, and primarily the farmers that participated in the 319 grant, whether they were in the nitrate test plots or in the cover cropping payments or any of the events that we have there. We're going to reach out to all of them. There is a Anna Cates, but there are two presenters that will be coming, and one in the morning they will be somewhere in Dodge County. So this is kind of a joint effort between Dodge County and Olmsted County. And in the afternoon, on March 10th, they will be at the St. Charles Community Room. And so asking for support for that afternoon session for so having these speakers come in and present. So that'll be coming up March 10th. And again, I do have the funds for that in the same grant. And the
Okay.
ask there was for $250.
What page is that in our packet?
Who's speaking at that?
Anna Cates is the main speaker.
Who's she with?
Thank you.
Do you have the page, what page I should be looking at?
No, this is just informational. I didn't have an action item for this one. This
So
is
there's-
something
there
that.
was, this is, okay, there was nothing in the packet, we're just receiving from you.
Right.
Okay.
And who does Anna work with, or who's she?
She works at the U of M, she's an or professor at UNM, but she's also the state soil health specialist.
And what is she gonna be talking about?
Soil health, I would guess.
Yes. Same thing.
So the donation is to pay for her to come, or, oh, so we
Yeah.
gotta pay her to come?
Yeah, so Angela was asking, she said we need about 250 to pay this.
Like just for travel.
Yeah, I think so.
So, I'm not following. Is this an action item or not? Are you asking for an approval today, or are we not?
This is something I brought up before, a couple months ago, mentioning that Angela was working on this workshop. And so now she had more information for me this time. And it'll be held on March 10th. And I'll be pulling money again through the same grant that we paid for the Ray Archuleta event. And this one, all the farmers that participated in the grant are the outreach group.
So you're not asking for an approval today. You're saying we approved that a few months ago, and you're just updating us on
Yeah,
what
it's a
we're-
part of the grant with the 319. So this one didn't really need approval, it's just getting.
I get lost when I don't see it in the packet.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I thought I was in the wrong place or something.
No,
Okay.
you're fine. And then, next item, the farm finance virtual webinars. And this is something that, the last thing that we can do with this grant is doing some farm finance workshops. And again, the outreach group would be the same farmers who participated in the cover crops and the nitrate test plots. And Emily and I had talked with this organization called Kitchen Table Consultants. And so they would work with farmers and helping them with their spreadsheets to identify what pieces of their operation are being profitable and what segments are being not profitable, and how adjustments can be made. But just letting you know that that's kind of one of the things I'm trying to get working on. One of the things I would like to do, there's a farmer in Iowa that could be a guest speaker for one of these, and so these are all just very preliminary talks right now, nothing hard and fast, but just letting you know that's the last piece to do for 319 nitrogen reduction grant, because everything Jeff has done is complete. And the cover crops, we just have one potential payment left to do. And so we're getting towards the end of the grant now.
So what is the timeline for?
The grant ends September 2022. Yeah.
So no action?
No action, I'm just giving you an update for where that grant stands right now.
Any other discussion, questions? If not, we'll move on to item D, sale of Whitewater Power Board computer.
Yeah, I'm all completely moved out of the Lewiston office location, and this is something I brought up at the last meeting, what we can do with that computer, because it's just 2 years old. And doing research online and talking with people, a computer 2 years old is worth about half of what we paid for it at the beginning. And so I connected with IT at Winona. There was no interest on their end to buy back the computer. I connected with the partner SWCDs, and either they just had new computers and didn't need another one, or like for Olmsted County, they get all their computers through Olmsted County because they're set up with them. So no interest on that end. I asked individuals. Wanda Anderson at Winona County SWCD said she would be interested in personally purchasing it.
Is this a laptop or a standalone workstation?
This is a desk computer.
Like a tower with a monitor?
Yeah, with
Has a
monitor.
tower and a monitor? The
Yep.
monitor you're selling also, or just the tower?
The monitor the monitor was purchased at the same time as the computer.
So it's a package.
Yeah,
And that's going with the computer.
it was, the computer itself was $506 purchase price. The monitor was $124, and then there was under $10 for the cables and connecting pieces. Total cost was $639.
Not a big issue to me, no, we can get rid of it.
Yeah, it doesn't do any good to put it in storage.
No,
I mean,
no,
it's-
it'll just be outdated
Yeah,
soon.
it will.
Is that a motion?
So Wanda is interested in it for $325 basically, or is that what I'm
Well,
hearing?
it's 639, so 320 would be half.
Yeah, it's fine with me. We've exhausted all the government. We talked to you, Homestead, and Winona, I don't know, Wabasha.
Yeah, and it's under,
Governments want to stay with their own program.
I think it's under $500, so we don't actually have to put it out for bid, I believe is what the statute is.
Oh, is that what it says?
Yeah, because I know when I was the mayor, we had some of those things. I think it's $500, so we should be okay. You might want to just double check that.
We
Where do I
routinely
check
on our,
that?
What's that?
Where do I check that?
You can go right on the state statute line. Just type in, just Google Minnesota selling municipal items, and it should, it's a state. We ran into it with a snowplow issue one time where we had to basically put it out for bid, and, and it was, we didn't think it was under 500, it was an old one, but then it ended up selling for $1,500, and then it was a whole big uproar, and, yeah, so
All right.
people get weird.
So I will check that first.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'll check that
I don't know
first.
what
So
that
do
is.
we want to have a
Dollar.
vote on this then to decide?
What's that?
I don't know what the dollar amount is.
I think it's 500.
I don't know.
I don't know, routinely on Winona County Board, we'll have a line item that comes through, dispose of excess equipment. And, I'm sure that the total of a lot of that equipment exceeds $500. So, I think we have authority as a board to dispose of it, however we want to dispose of it.
I know we ran into that. I'm just throwing it out there. I don't remember what the number was, but I know there was a
Well,
whole.
the only way the information is gonna get out is if somebody in this room speaks. So I move that we proceed. with
I
getting
think
rid of
we're
it.
okay with that. So I believe it is actually $500,
No, this is under that anyhow.
but yep, so we're okay.
Yeah.
Second?
Motion. Second. Any discussion? All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Be your soul. All right, surface water assessment grant update.
Okay, and just to say that January 15th was the end date for that surface water assessment grant, and I submitted all the required materials, and I think, yeah, that was included in the packet and put that in there. That's the final data report that I submitted. And so this data goes to, well, the MPCA, it's in the Equius database, which is the statewide database for all water quality monitoring data. Yeah. So we're done with that one. And also I had on some of the payments that were approved today were our partners on this. The way this particular grant was done, I could, anytime I submitted an invoice, they only paid 90%. There was a 10% retainage that was withheld. So then I've also taken care of, that's all done and done too. So anyway.
Okay, any other discussion?
I was just wondering, in the online packet, and I don't know if it was this item or not, there was something right at the end about some money left over that went to buying equipment for?
Yes, Root SWCD. There was about $800 that was not used in the grant, and MPCA left that open if there was any of the partners that would be interested in purchasing monitoring equipment or any other projects that they were doing. So, I'm trying to think of what they purchased. The DO meter, that's what, the equipment that was purchased for this grant after 12 months, it's not good anymore. You know, some of the probes, because they get so full, so they can't be calibrated to be useful. So that's what they did with, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up.
All right, any other discussion? Hearing none. Item F, 319 nitrogen test plot summary report.
Yep.
We usually get the dim one up there.
This one?
Yeah.
Do you want me to share?
If you can make this one work, that'd be fine.
I think that's as bright as it gets.
Yep, that's brighter than usual.
I've had people tell me I was a dim ball before, but I think this time it's true. So it's good to see you guys again, and I think it was June 17th, the last time I was here. So I'm going to give you an update on the project since then, and a little bit of it will be repeat, and this is one slide. This is part of the reason why we're here. We know that the wellhead testing has shown that we've got areas here in the karst in southeast Minnesota that have some private wells and public wells that are over that 10 part per million kind of water quality standard. And this is an upgraded chart, and kind of right in here where we are in Winona County and northeastern Olmsted County is certainly some of the areas where we see the higher concentrations. The reason is nitrogen moving through this permeable soils into the fractured bedrock and into groundwater, and then sometimes that groundwater comes out in an ephemeral stream or trout stream and ends up in the surface waters, and that can have not only health concerns for people drinking that water, but also for some of the wildlife as well. And we know the land use in the area. So the goal of the project is to reduce end loss and improve water quality by trying to encourage farmers to adopt more BMPs on the landscape in their agricultural lands. And nitrogen-specific BMPs are specific to different geographic regions, and we have different ones for southeast Minnesota. We have different ones for coarse textured soils in south central and other regions across the state. So the specific BMPs are how we're going to do this. We're going to work closely with these farmers and their ag advisors to help increase their confidence in. And I think that's a big part of it, is that they know that these BMPs and these N-rate guidelines are there, but they want to have confidence in it by seeing it on their farm or in their fields. And if you do that for a couple of years, maybe that helps build confidence not only for the grower, but for the retailer, that the two work together in these decisions. And we're doing this by utilizing these on-farm research strip trials and some education to increase the adoption of these BMPs. And the focus of this study was looking at nitrogen rate. That was the primary treatment. There's a couple of these that have interactions with side dress or split application, but mainly we're focusing on two rates, looking at a farmer's rate and then something that's reduced that's closer to the N rate or to the guidelines of the U of M. So this one's I'm gonna have to read because there's a lot of stuff on there and it's hard for you guys to see it. But so the treatments are on the left. As I said, there were varied nitrogen rate treatments. We had 5 sites this year. The site at Fremont was a Waukegan loam, but it had some of this Flagler sandy loam and another soil that was actually a loamy sand. So this was kind of unique. We got these little lenses and pockets of coarse textured soils underlain by bedrock in southeast Minnesota. This was near Fremont. So this soil is actually kind of unique from the rest of them because it's not the typical loess bedrock, but it also is a very sensitive one because it's a medium coarse textured sand, and the depth of bedrock in that soil is only like 3.5 feet. Site 2 was near St. Charles, just straight north of St. Charles was Seton Silt Loam. The first site, the farmer applied 40 pounds of N at planting plus a V5, V6 somewhere in that area, side dress as ammonia, and he had 3 N rates total in the study. The second site was a Seton Silt Loam. He had a base N rate plus a side dress, and it was plus or minus. Either the field didn't get the side dress or it got the side dress. And that was no-tilled into a rye cover crop. Site 3 was similar. It was a Mount Carroll silt loam. It had 2 N rates. They were pre-plant applied plus the side dress. The side dress was uniform across the whole field, and that was also no-tilled into a rye cover crop. So those first 3 sites I have in bold, and I think those are 3 good examples of growers that are already doing some BMPs on the landscape. The no-till, the coarse textured soil, he's putting on only a small amount of starter N, and he's side dressing the majority of it fairly late. At V5, it was actually probably closer to V6. So those are, I mean, they're already doing some good practices. The last 2 sites, site 4 was a Mount Carroll silt loam. He had 2 N rates that were pre-plant incorporated, and site 5 was similar, a Mount Carroll silt loam, pre-plant incorporated base rate, plus or minus 30 pounds with the planter, and that was his different rate. Either he applied the planter in or he didn't. On the right are the different things we measured. Pre-plant nitrogen test for soil to 2 feet, 2 transects. Pre-side dress nitrate test for soil in early June, either by rep or by plot, depending upon the treatment structure. Again, 2 different transects in the field or 2 different areas across the field. Took plant populations, did some imagery. I'm not going to show the imagery today. Basal stock nitrate in September, took 10 stocks per plot, analyzed for nitrate. Combine yield map was a significant part, and then fall soil samples after harvest to a 3-foot depth, looking at residual soil nitrate in the profile. That's kind of one of our measuring sticks for leftover N, and that could end up in surface waters. Do you have a question?
Yep. So we're looking at 21.2 SC. So when they say they're no-till with their side dressing, how are they applicating their method? What's their application method?
Yeah. So the site, I did not see the pre-plant application, but when I was there, I assumed it was a broadcast application, and the side dress was a top dress.
Was it top?
Now at the Seton site, it was a stream injection UAN. I saw that, or I talked to him. Or the site 2.
Site 2, that was what was that?
That was UAN. Site 3 and 4, I'm pretty sure the split applications were top dress urea with probably with a urea.
So they're actually technically tilling if they're incorporating it.
No, only site 4 and 5 actually were pre-plant incorporated. Site 2 and 3, I believe, were left
No,
on.
I mean, but they're still dragging through the soil.
Correct.
Disturbing the soil, and they no-till.
In site 2, the
Yeah.
side dress was a injected. The other one was a top dress.
Right.
Yeah. So the sites 1, 4, and 5 were what I would consider conservation tillage, and 2 and 3 were a modified no-till, following the cover
The
crop.
3, they just threw it on top.
Correct.
Okay.
Jeff, I'm just wondering, what's side dress?
So that side dress is the application at the time of when the corn's, anywhere from V2 or anywhere from merge to waist high. So you're gonna go out and put your N on, and if I show an N uptake curve, which would have been a good example, I can show you the majority of the corn plant, or the majority of the nitrogen that the corn plant takes up is taken up after the corn is about this high, about V5 to V6, or about 10 to 12 inches. It only needs about 10 to 15 pounds, maybe 20 pounds of N prior to that.
Looks like that.
Yep. So if you side dress or you do a split application, you delay that application till, in this case, like early June. And that's right when that plant gets in that rapid growth phase where it needs the nitrogen and where it's going to take it up. So you narrow that window that the nitrogen is in the field prior to the application, or prior to the crop needing it, So hopefully that minimizes the potential for it to be lost. We're narrowing that window up and putting it on right before it needs it, which is really important in the coarse textured soil that's shallow over bedrock. And it's important in these lush soils too, because they're permeable, you get a lot of rain, water moves through them pretty rapidly. It can move that and down deeper in the profile. It's not always lost immediately, but it gets below the rooting depth, and then if the roots don't get there, they can't scavenge it or take it up before it gets below that depth.
It's a slang term for the original way they used to do it, so it covers just about, so whether you're broadcasting and just throwing it all over, it's still kind of considered side dress.
Yeah.
The way they used to have side dress, and they still do, they have side dress machines that used to put and inject it in right kind of near the side of the plant. But it's kind of been adapted into basically, it should be like split application is really what it is, but side dress is just slang term in agronomy for we're putting on another time, regardless of the way how we're doing it. Does that make a sense? It's kind of a slang term.
And if you go in the mid-south, they call it top dress,
Top
because most of
dress.
it's just broadcast. So they just drive over the top and spread some more on in the middle of the season. And that's done in forages as well, because you can't have it, typically inject it. They're gonna have to leave it on the surface. So I think I talked about where the sites were before, and it's really dark on the screen, but we had one down here in Fremont, we had one up there in Bethany, or just north of Utica, one pretty much straight north, a little northeast, actually really close to the park here, right at the edge of the park, straight about 5 miles straight north of St. Charles, and then two just a little bit north of 74, or one of them was just west of 74, and the other one is about 5 miles or 6 miles northwest of St. Charles. So I think all of them, but Fremont is in Winona County, the other two St. Charles ones, the Bethany ones in Winona County, and the two that are west of 74 are in Olmsted, on the edge of Olmsted County. So the soil, or this growing season precipitation, the two sites on the left are from last year. This is right out of the table from the annual report. I highlighted Fremont, I'll talk about that in a moment. So I use this, the DNR Weather Observer database. You can pick a location and it'll give you data from it'll interpolate or extrapolate, find the closest observer and give you that data. So it's not in situ, it's not right on that site. But oftentimes you find an observer that's within 2 miles of the location, or maybe 3, and that's pretty accurate data. If you're that close, the precip that they saw is going to be very close to what that field is. You will notice that sites 3 and 4 have the exact same data, and those sites were so close together that I got the same observer when I picked that location. In general, as you know, we had a very dry April and a very dry September and October. Where we were in south central, southwestern Minnesota, the whole growing season was dry, but here in southeastern Minnesota, there was rainfall in the middle of the summer. It was pretty timely, and these totals are actually pretty close within an inch to 2 inches of the long-term normal. So even though it was a drier portions of the growing season, the growing season in its entirety was actually pretty close to normal. The Fremont site I think is interesting because I mentioned it before that's that coarse textured soil. It's a loamy sand, sandy loam over that gravel and bedrock at about 3.5, 4 feet. It only has about 5 to 5.5 inches of water holding capacity. It only received 18.5 inches of rainfall, but it did get some good shots in July and August. And it's interesting when we get to that site, the yields, and talk about how that plot yielded considering its lack of water holding capacity.
I just think this is a very, very crucial thing right here.
Oh, compared to last year, yes.
This is where all that pre-plant nitrogen is lost right
Yeah.
here. That number to this number is the difference
Definitely.
of a huge amount of N loss.
Typically June is the
Correlating to
big
yield.
N loss month, and this year's June was relatively hot, or was very warm and relatively dry. So the N loss potential, that's a good point. It was a low N loss potential.
That's 40 bushel quarts.
Yeah. So this was our spring soil nitrate, and I think I actually showed you guys this data when I was here in June. So we got the sites on the left, the previous crop, the first sites, corn after corn, the other 4 were corn after soybean. We've got the cover crop, sites 2 and 3 had a rye cover crop. So the PPNT data, this column, is taken, those samples are taken before any of this fertilizer N is applied. The PSNT sample is purposely timed right before this application, but after this. So it shows that some N has been, the data large change shows that some N has been applied, but it's before the side dress applications in the 3 sites that got side dress applications, which are sites 1, 2, and 3. And the reason why this is a 0 and a 57 is that's how that person changed his rate. He either put a side dress on some plots or he didn't. So what do I notice about that? The PPNTs were the rye cover crop. I highlighted those in red. They're less than 5 part per million. So it shows that that cereal rye, even though I was in that field in the spring, there was not a great cereal rye stand. It was kind of spotty. It's what you typically see, but it was green and it was still alive and healthy. It was probably terminated in mid-April while I was there in mid-April. It did reduce the nitrate comparatively to the other sites. Now that's not we don't have a treatment comparison, so we can't say that that definitely had a difference, but in comparison to the other sites, it was less. The other thing we'll talk about in a minute is that you can see a couple of these sites are over 6 part per million, and that's where we would start actually giving a credit. If you did a PPNT soil test in the spring and you found greater than 6 part per million, I'll show you a table, we would actually credit some nitrogen, and that may have some impact on the responses that we saw. So when we get to the PSNT, the site number 1 was the site that majority of the N was side dressed, only 40 pounds was applied pre-plant, and then he had 3 side dress N rates. And we really had a long conversation with that grower about what rate to side dress and what total N rate we wanted to apply. Because we know that that soil doesn't have a very good water holding capacity. It's not irrigated. It's a sandy soil. It's part of that field. But a significant portion of that field is a decent silt loam soil. So should we treat it like regular corn on corn, or should we treat it like a non-irrigated sand that isn't going to yield very well and should have a very low N rate? So we had that discussion, and that's the reason why we picked 3 N rates, so we could kind of cross that whole span of what you might do on that field from an N standpoint. And I'll get to that in a moment. But so that site already had 17 part per million in the PSNT, and that was only after the 40 pounds applied at planting. So I'll show you the equation here in a moment. You take 25 part per million, subtract that 17, multiplied by 8, that's the Iowa State tool. So I would have said that that site only needed another 64 pounds of N if you went by the tool. And the other thing you'll see that all the rest of these data, except for that 24, are all greater than 25. That's the critical value. So it would have said that all those other plots at that point had an adequate nitrogen, if you use that tool to make your decision. So this is the table for the PSNT. So from 0 to 6 part per million, the U of M gives no credit. From 6.1 to 9.0, we give a 35 pound N credit, and then it goes up from there. So 2 of those sites could have been given a 35 pound N credit, and maybe the N rate reduced, and that partly due to probably the past climatic conditions and that dry spring where we didn't really lose hardly any N that was mineralized early, and we had a warm mid-May through early June was really warm. Now that would have, the PPNT samples were taken well before that, of course. And then this is the Iowa State PSNT tool where you take 25 part per million, subtract the PSNT. At the one site I mentioned it was 17, so I would give you 8. You multiply it by 8, and that's the pounds of N to apply side dress. That's another method. And I'm using the Iowa State tool there because in Minnesota we actually don't have a recommendation for that. Our recommendation is it just has to be over 25 part per million, and then you don't do anything. But Iowa State is actually calibrated there so that it makes a recommendation. So these are the corn grain yields from the 5 sites for 2021, and the x-axis I'll read because it's pretty small and I know it's very faded, so you're going to have a hard time seeing those rates. The y-axis starts at the bottom at 100 bushels and it goes up to about 260 at the top. And it's the same axes and the same scale for every plot, except for the N rates are different. So starting up there in the upper left, you see the yellow bars. That's the corn on corn site. That was the one near Fremont. And he had total N rates of 120, 160, and 200. So the U of M rec, if we treated that field like a conventional medium fine textured soil, would be 152 to 180, somewhere in there. So we purposely picked an N rate that was below that, one that was above that, and one that was right in the middle. And as you can see, those bars are the same height, there were no yield differences. So even the 120 pound rate in that field was adequate. And as I mentioned earlier, that soil only has about 5.5 inches of water holding capacity. It only received 18.5 inches of rain during the growing season, and it still produced over 200 bushels, which is pretty remarkable.
But I think if we would have had a year like 2020, that number would have been different.
Correct.
Because we would have lost, and that's the game as farmers play, is we never know what the weather is. That sets
And
the
it
bar.
probably, and if we'd had a wetter year, it probably would have yielded more too, because it would have got more water.
Yeah.
So the other thing that was interesting in that field is when I got there the first time to take stand counts and to take the Psnt samples, I'm like, where are all the plants? There was not a very good stand in that field. It was dry when he worked it and planted it. It was a coarse textured soil, and it didn't rain for like 2.5 weeks afterwards.
Well, and in Fremont, there was actually a crusting.
Well, it's
They had a hard
a
rain.
sandy loam, so it didn't really crust. But
There was a bunch of guys over there that were scrambling. My brother farms at Fremont,
Okay.
right, just literally a mile south of
Okay.
Fremont. And there was a lot of crusting. They had a rain come through, and they were scrambling to find rotary hose.
Okay.
So that's,
So he, because the site has low water holding capacity, he purposely plants a lower population than would be ideal, but it just, germination was poor, and there was only about 19 to 20,000 plants out there, which by today's standards is really low. So to get 200 bushels with that amount of water and 19,000 plants, that's impressive. The St. Charles site, he had N rates of 150 or 207. The 150 is just a little bit above the maximum of the recommended range or acceptable range in the N rate calculator. That was our close to U of M rate. And there were no difference. I think that's a numeric 3 bushel difference, but statistically it was not different. On the lower left is the other St. Charles site. They had 140, 145, I believe, and 171. So 145 would be close to the maximum of that acceptable range. And that's actually a number that I kind of encourage growers. That's a good starting point to think about. And there were no differences there. Actually, in fact, the higher N rate yielded a little bit less numerically, but it wasn't statistically different. Site 4 was a very high yielding site. It was over 250 bushels. The rates there were 136 or 171, and again, there was no significant difference. There was a numerical, like 3 bushel greater yield for the 171, but not statistically different. And then the site 5, they had 173 or 203, so even the 173 was above our what we would recommend, but that was his low or reduced rate. The 203 is what he typically uses in corn after beans, and there was no yield difference there. And the yields were a little poorer there. That site had a good stand. It had ideal water pretty much all year long, but the hybrid he chose unfortunately went down and had a lot of standability issues. And when I was there taking basal stock nitrate, I think it was the last site I did, and I said a few naughty words while I was there. It was like walking through a jungle. It was so twisted up, and I was amazed that he got over 200 bushel corn out of that. Because obviously his combine does a good job of picking up down corn. So, comments: no significant yield differences among any of the sites in 2021. The Fremont site had over 200 bushel corn with 19,000 plants and only 18.5 inches of water and a really poor water holding capacity field. At 3 of the 4 corn after bean sites, the low rate was greater than the max of what the U of M recommendation was. But you know, they were close. 2 of them were really close. So this should build some confidence. But as you said, it's Josh, right? As Josh said, this was a real low end stress year. I'm not surprised by these data. And the growers and their ag advisors shouldn't really be surprised.
if we
by
would have
it.
flipped those rainfall amounts, these charts would have looked a whole lot different, I think.
Yeah.
You know, you would have saw more early season end loss correlating back to a bigger pressure on the backside to try to get that out. I'm just going to ask the group if it's okay, because I know it's not on the agenda when he's done, if I can just have 5 minutes of time afterwards to show how these new things will have a direct impact on exactly what he's studying here, how to hold N. If that's okay, just, all I need is that whiteboard in 5 minutes. I want to show you guys something really cool, if that's okay. This stuff is awesome. We just got to take it into consideration because rainfall, soil structure is so indicative of how these things are going to show up. Last year we had a backwards year of what we normally see, dry followed by moisture, and that is indicative of being able to manage and hold nitrogen better. You flip that, it's totally different. And I want to show you guys a cool thing that's coming out, why I'm so excited about these things, how to help manage all this. And I'm going to just draw it out so you guys can see it, if that's okay. I'll take 5 minutes.
You can have 7,
Okay.
but that's it.
That's it.
Giving you 2 extra already.
So this is the data that kind of shocked me, but it didn't shock me because we saw it at other sites, and we had submitted some samples from other sites, and these samples got submitted a little bit later. But this is the basal stock nitrate, and the optimum is 700 to 2,000. So the red line here is the line that they should all be below that. If it's above the red line, they're excessive. The only site that's really below it is here. And then there's a sporadic one, but all the rest of them are above it. And the scale over here,
Which is normal
It's-
for a drier year.
correct, but the
Or-
scale is,
yeah.
Josh, the scale is 14,000.
I know. I've done
In my
hundreds
career,
of
I had
these.
never seen values over 10 prior to these.
Yeah.
And typically, if they're excessive, they're in the 4,000 to 6,000 range. So these are off the
They're
charts.
way off the charts.
And I had, we had a bunch of N rate studies, and you guys probably know Dawn Bernal. She had some NMI studies in the area, and she found every site, or a lot of them, were like this. They were just very high.
But your basal stock test is all over the board to start with.
Correct. That's why I put the individual, so these are the individual values. I mean, here's one rate, and you got a value here, you got a sample there, you got a sample up there. That's why, personally, I've never put a lot of value in that test, because it's all over the board.
It's all over the board in your field.
And it's, and we're taking 10 samples, 10 stocks from plants, then grinding them, mixing them, blending them. If you just took 1 or 2 stocks, who knows what you'd get. So why? The dry spring and fall. I think that's a big part of it. Excess N or minimal N loss, definitely a part of it. We know that none of these sites responded to additional N, so likely they're going to have luxury consumption. I think the other part is that generally the low plant populations. You get plants that are not densely, at a conventional 30,000 or greater population, and they're going to find nutrients. You get these huge tree trunk stocks, and they're going to luxury take up nutrients after the grain has been filled, and it's going to stay in that stock. So it was a concerning year for people that maybe were chopping corn and ensiling it. You want to make sure you had good ensiling and not be green chopping or green feeding this stuff, because that would have not been good for animals that were lactating or gestating, especially with those high nitrate concentrations. But if you get good ensiling, it shouldn't be an issue. That'll be turned to proteins that the animals can digest. So, but yeah, all over the board. This last chart is interesting because it takes the 4 corn after bean sites and it plots them by N rate and response, and you see this general relationship where the higher the N rate, they tend to be going up. Now you look over at the Fremont site, and that thing is just weird. It's like it goes down with higher N rate, and I could not explain why. But when I show some soil data, maybe I have a reason why after I looked at some of the other data. So this is the soil data that we took after harvest, and I've highlighted the plots that were significantly different in red. And you see the RSN1 and the RSN2. We took 2 transects in every field. Since these are larger farm fields, I don't want to just take 1 transect across. I want to take 2 spots so that we can kind of see what it is in 2 different areas of the field, because there's soil variability in the field, and you don't want to just rely on. And we did take 2 cores from each plot too, and we sampled every plot in all 3 reps. So there's about 60 or 70 cores go into one of these studies, or one of these examples. So on the Fremont site, the 120, as you see, there was 123 part per million, or 123 pounds now, not part per million. And that also had the study where the basal stock was greater with the lower end rate. I think what happened there, it might be safe to say, is that that field probably had a misapplication and maybe an overlap, because most of that high number came from one sample in the first plot. And it was at the edge of the field, not right at the field edge in the guest rows, but at the edge. So I think he must have overlapped in there. Maybe it wasn't his application, maybe it was a previous application overlapped in that field, and that's why that area was high. Otherwise, there were no differences other than the 123 is greater than the 68s. At the other area of the field, in the back side of the field, on the north side, there was no difference in residual soil nitrate, but higher numbers, 90 to 98, 93, 98 pounds per acre, which is pretty significant in 3-foot depth. Site 2, I highlighted in green. There's numeric differences, but you see the letters are the same. That wasn't statistically different. Site 3, in the one end of the field, it was greater, but it was only 7 pounds greater, and those numbers are actually really low. But Site 3 also was one of the sites that had the lowest total N rates on both sides of or both treatments were at lower rates, and the basal stock number or values were lower too than the other sites. They were actually in the optimum range. Site 4, no significant differences. Site 5, numeric differences, pretty high values down here. And remember that his high rate was like 205, so that's well above what we would recommend for corn after beans. So we'll talk to him about that. And then the bottom is the average of the corn soybean sites, and I just put U of M, or approximate guideline rate versus the farmer practice, as FP. So since all these rates are different, you can't really pick a rate, so I just kind of lumped them together. And you can see now when I pool all 4 of those sites and run an analysis of statistics, then they're significantly different. So it's, there's some power there to show that, yeah, if we're going to put on rates that are above what our guideline rates are, we're likely to have a little more nitrogen left in the soil profile after harvest, and then we know what can happen to that in the future. Whether it happens to it next year in the spring or summer before the next crop starts growing, we don't know, but it could potentially be lost. So to summarize, from 2018 through 2021, when Jake started this project and I've concluded it, we had 15 N trials were conducted at the Whitewater watershed. Often a farmer's N rate was compared to a rate that was near the U of M guideline using the corn N rate calculator. Only one of those 15 sites, a site in 2019, a corn-on-corn site that was actually a sandy soil, had a statistically greater yield with the higher N rate compared to the U of M corn N rate calculator rate. So that's pretty good, and the 1 out of 15. Now there was another site in 2019 that had a 15 bushel greater yield with the higher rate or the farmer rate. The difference was not statistically significant within that field or that site, but I would say that it definitely had a greater economic return and it had a practically significant rate, whether it was statistical or not. So it'd be 2 out of 15 sites if you count that one. N rates near the max of the profitable range in the corn N rate calculator produced equal yields and or often produced greater economic returns than N rates that were 30 to 57 pounds per acre greater. And that was using prices from the last 3 or 4 years, not prices that we're going to see going forward. So I was using prices that, like $4 corn, 40-cent N, or $4.50, 45 cents, somewhere in there. At a few of these sites, the U of M rates reduced RSN, or residual soil nitrate, and that would help the water quality issue by minimizing the potential for that N to be lost into the environment. With that, I just want to thank the funding source, the 319 grant with USDA, the farmer cooperators, their ag advisors, and their retailers for helping coordinate things and working with it. You guys here on the board, really appreciate your patience. The transition last year from Jake taking this to me taking this during the middle of a pandemic was kind of a crazy time. This year's been a lot easier, a lot more smooth sailing. And then I also really want to appreciate Brad Carlson and Don Bernal for extracting yield data from combine yield maps and stuff, and then processing it and getting me the data. The reason why this kind of got late, I was expecting to have this done over a month ago, So we had one farmer site this year where he sent me the data from his yield monitor, and we couldn't do anything with it. And he sent it again, and we couldn't do anything with it. And we were looking at it, and we were trying to use the software that we had, and we couldn't read it. So finally Don says, I'll just go to his farm or his house, and I'll sit down with his yield monitor, and we'll download it, I'll extract it, I'll get it to the format, I'll bring it in my computer and make sure it works, and then I'll send it to you. So I really appreciate her taking the time to do that. And that took like a 3-4 week period, so it was pretty much the whole end of January through the first couple weeks of February trying to get that done. So, and then I appreciate Sheila and Annie for their communication and managing the grant stuff. So, you guys have any questions?
I'm just curious how all this information gets used
Okay.
outside of a nice presentation like this.
So one of the other deliverables was to have a meeting with the growers, and I've been setting that up in the last week and a half, and I've sent the report to each of the growers, and then I've also interacted with them about, on a person-to-person basis, if they'd like to have it. Last year we did not have a face-to-face meeting. I did one over Zoom, but we only had 2 farmers. This year they said that they would like to have a face-to-face meeting, so we're in the process of coordinating that. It'll probably occur the week of March 7th. That's our planning dates. Just got to talk to 2 more people and finalize the date and the location. So we'll share this information with them. They all got a copy of the report, as did their ag advisors. We'll talk about what we talked about. You know, that Josh, you're spot on. This year was a different year. It was dry in the spring, and loss potential was minimal. So these U of M guideline rates were more than enough. In fact, we might have been able to go even less, because if you notice that most of those lower rates were still at the higher end of the guideline. We could have probably got by with 20-30 pounds less this year in some of those locations. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the residual soil nitrate, how we see that's creeping up there where we have those higher farmer rates. And you know, it's a good time to have these discussions because fertilizer nitrogen is really expensive. It's a good time to be thinking about, maybe I can cut back a little bit, save myself some money, not really affect the production cost, actually get a greater return on investment. Most of these sites, I didn't do it for everyone, but just the math in my head, I'd say more than 50% of them had a greater return on investment for that reduced rate. So how does that impact society? I think that it comes down to if you can work with these growers and their retailers, because a lot of times the retailers make the decisions, not always the grower. We think that they have the final say, but a lot of times the retailer makes a suggestion and they give it the green light. They give it their rubber stamp, and that's what they do. If you can get them to work together and look at this information and say, okay, we've done this 1 or 2 years on my field. I like what I'm seeing, but I'm not convinced yet. Let's keep doing it, just the 2 of us, a couple more years, and see if we keep seeing the same thing. And if that's the case, then they build that confidence and trust that they can reduce those rates. And BMPs alone is not going to change all of the water quality issues. It's just not. There's other things that are probably going to happen down the road. But it's a step, and we know that N rate is one of the biggest factors. If we can get these N rates close to our recommended guidelines or in that window, that's going to have a big impact on the amount of N that's lost. The next other things that we can do is cover crops. Got a couple of these growers who are already doing that. That making sure the timing was right. Site number 1 in Fremont, he knew he had a coarse textured field. He likes to side dress. He side dressed late. So you didn't put a lot of N out there up front. That's a good practice. And there's other things that can be done as well. But those are the key things.
Depends on what a person's objective is. I know a lot of people, especially in the past, never want to leave a bushel out
Yeah.
there. So better to always pour on more. But I've always been more frugal maybe. And don't worry about the absolute top yield. Somewhere is where it makes sense or what I usually expect, and if I can't brag that I've got that absolute last bushel, I don't care. But then of course it depends on your financial situation, but even if that's the deal, where you're paying higher rents, do you want to waste nitrogen for 3 years to hit that 1 year where you get the extra 15 bushel or something.
I wished I had 3 hours because I lay all that out.
Well,
But I got 7 minutes. I'm going to show you something really cool.
and the other thing that we try as educators in soil fertility from the University of Minnesota or from industry is we try to tell them is to start at a rate that is under good conditions is going to be enough. And then if the conditions, climatic conditions aren't what we know are conducive to that rate being enough, have a plan so you can go out there and maybe put some more on if necessary. Now I know in this rolling topography on some of these contour strips, side dressing is a lot more of a challenge than it is in our flat ground out in south central and southwestern Minnesota. And we had a lot of wet years in a row, 2015, 13, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, they were all wet. And I just laugh, but it happens. Here comes the air tractors, and they got urea, and they're flying over the fields and putting urea on in the middle of summer. But they just know that there's fields have had way too much rain. They probably had a lot of N loss. They look at imagery, they start seeing the yellow corn show up, and they know that they can rescue that and maybe get a few bushels out of it. And it oftentimes is profitable. And it probably isn't going to have an environmental negative because the crop needs that N if they apply it where it's needed and not just do it everywhere. And if you're going to take the time to have an airplane and put it on, you're probably going to make sure you put it where it's needed. So
Here's the question too, just the aspect of, I went to the Ray Arculeta thing yesterday, and of course I knew this before, but if people's soils were healthy and active and held on to things better and had a system going on instead of like some places are basically sand or dirt, not soil. And I found that it really is more forgiving because I've like never noticed nitrogen shortage, although I usually plant on alfalfa ground. And well, just for an example, although last year was freakish, but I made first crop hay off my strips crossed by 42 there. And so it was May 29th, I no-tilled corn, 80 pounds of ammonium sulfate. And I did put a little manure on a coating before I did that. And well, because the fall never ended, and I know that's the reason, I ended up getting 210 bushel at 25% moisture. And that's the way I always have liked to do it, just to keep the soil healthy, and you got a lot more forgiveness, I think. And also, even if it doesn't rain, it makes a big difference too if you have good organic matter. So,
yeah.
and those are things that have a byproduct of making some of this maybe work better, or not having to sprinkle stuff on all the way through too.
And these 5 sites this year and the 2 sites last year were pretty indicative of the soils here in Winona and Olmsted County. This year we actually probably had some more soils that were highly erodible. A couple of those fields had some sea slopes on them. But the Seton and the Mount Carol's, those are good soils. I mean, they're very highly productive. The Seton just has a little lower organic matter, and sometimes there's a little shallower to bedrock. But Mount Carol's and Port Byron's, we didn't have any Port Byron's this year. Those are the best soils in this area. And we've had research plots at the Lawler farm there just east of Rochester for 30 some years now. And if you can't grow 200 bushel corn there, there's something wrong with you, because that's like the best soil in the whole state of Minnesota. So yeah, there's areas that are pretty fortunate, and you're right. They also, these silt loam soils, they're deep rooting crop. They're well drained. They're deep rooting, so the plants do really well in them, and you generally get enough rainfall. It's just a little cooler than maybe other parts of the state, but production is good. The site number 1, he was a cooperator from last year. And, he and I would talk about N-rate decisions, and he's like, "Well, I like to kind of flirt with the lower side of everything." He said, "I side dress with anhydrous, and not too many people do that, so I think I can get by with less." And I think that's just his experience, and that's probably those are good experiences. He's taken his own past experiences and saying, "Yeah, I can get by with less compared to some others."
I think that's what a lot of growers have to do. You have to prove it to yourself the way you farm on your acres.
That's the key, because every one of these scenarios is so different.
Yeah.
You know,
And not everybody's gonna have alfalfa.
Yep.
You know, if the whole world starts doing that, there'll be so much alfalfa, there's no market. Now,
And you've said it many times before, Josh, and I agree with you, we as a board or the university can't go out and say, no-till and cover crops is the only way to farm. It
Yeah.
needs to be proven on your soil, on your farm, the way you farm.
Yeah.
well, and that's, so what's coming in the industry now is the side effects of no-till. And so coming in, where no-till was heavily adapted down in Iowa, so this is the second thing this fall that it was just unbelievable. That conversation, now it's moving to nitrogen, is how do we deal with all this trash? This no-till thing's starting to build up. We're getting this N tie-up, so now I'm gonna put more N on. Well, we realize putting more N on breaks it down, oxidizes it. We don't create humus out of it. We smoke all the CO2 off into the air. We're not storing it. And now we're seeing more disease and insect pressure because you can't get rid of the stocks. So now we're using more fungicide. The fungicide stops the stock degradation because it's not selective, thus stopping the train. Now we're creating a bigger problem. So now what's happening, the second side that's going on is how do we naturally get rid of the stocks? How do we naturally get rid of these things? So that's where the biological sector is coming back in again, playing with the chemical and the physical sectors. And so those are the two big trends that we're seeing in the Midwest that we are talking about over and over and over is stock residue and nitrogen management. Stock residue, nitrogen management. And the industry is starting to catch up that we can't keep farming this chemical way because we solve one problem and create two more. So this combination of how do we deal with those things, it's the adverse thing of no-till. So, and even if you are tilling, this residue isn't breaking down in the soil, creating these more and more problems. So we have very, very actively gone out and tried to educate ag retailers, hey, we've got to manage this residue problem. Hey, we got to manage this end problem because the residue problem is creating an end problem. So then they're putting more nitrogen on to get rid of the residue, which goes back to this problem.
Yep.
And then actually they're destroying the soil structure because it breaks it down too fast, doesn't create the humus, which is our water holding retention and nitrogen holding and everything else. So it's this vicious circle.
It is.
And we're trying to stop it and go, look guys, you got to look at things a little bit different. And that's part of it. Just give me a few minutes. I can explain very, very briefly how some of these things are acting really cool. So, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you guys' time and for squeezing me in the program here on short notice. And I would have got this to you last week, but it wasn't quite done last week, and I didn't want to promise something I couldn't deliver on.
Great, no, I appreciate it, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And that is what I'm seeing anyway, and other people in our groups are seeing, is that farmers are taking more control and they're actually going against their advisors and saying, hey, I don't want to keep doing the same thing. I want to do something different. You know, the answer right now is not putting more N on because every year is variable and it's not, the ROI isn't necessarily there. Can I have a few minutes? You guys have to.
Josh, I was just finished with one thing, is that, you know, I've been doing this now for my career almost over 30 years, or about 30 years. And, you know, our old guideline system, we used to talk about like 1 pound of N per bushel and take a credit for soybeans. And we're still seeing that.
Yeah.
That's still what a lot of, you know, that's what, well, I want to get 250 bushel corn, so I need 200 pounds of N. And you know, I think the efficiency of the genetics is a lot different. And if you're doing other BMPs, you're doing other things right, it's not necessary to have that much. And at the same time, though, I mean, I understand growers, it's a business. They don't want to leave bushels on the table,
Yep.
and I get that too.
But I
It
had
is,
that,
yeah.
I had that same discussion with my agronomist one day when we were looking at our rates. And he knows what other guys, other producers are putting on. And yeah, they might be getting 250 bushel corn, but they're dumping on 250 pounds of N. Then you better get 250 bushel corn if you're dumping that kind of N.
The complexity to it is it's going to take a certain amount of N to grow a bushel of corn regardless. What we're doing is saying how much N do I need to supply to offset where it's getting these other areas? How much is going to leach? How much do I, you know, that's what we're always trying, and that's exactly what I'm going to spell out.
And in these wet years, like, you know, the N rates that we in other areas of the southeastern Minnesota, we went through so many wet growing seasons where we did see a lot of N responses that were over 200 pounds of N per acre, especially when we had corn after beans. or corn after corn. So this year was pretty unique, but you know, it was done over, this project was done over 4 years at, with 15 sites, and all but 2 of them pretty much got by with that reduced rate.
So the question becomes, I'm gonna need, so 0.8 to 1.2 is the industry standard. That's where it's at, so 1 would be right in the middle, right? So in genetics, even Bayer said, hey, we're gonna get down to 0.7. So the genetic, when you cross a male and female, you can gauge how much supply and typically does it take to produce a bushel of corn out of that one plant, right? So you're spot on. So we're gonna see that get better. The reality of it is as farmers, we go out and we look at a field and we say, hey, we're gonna apply a certain amount of N. Now we can variable rate that N based on yield too. But what this new thing is doing is it's beginning, there's 3 coined terms. It's a statutization, a regulation, and an insurance. So you go down to Iowa, everybody puts on 30 units of insurance in, because they're factoring in loss. Okay, so that's what they're doing. So what he talked about was, let's just pick on corn, plant tassel harvest. We tend to see end needs go like this in corn, okay? So, and this is really crude, but it doesn't need a whole lot up front, then there's a heavy pull, and then we start to erupt. So when we apply our N, typically the amount of N that's available does something like that. If we get a wet year, it's like that. If we get a dry year, it's gonna follow closer to that curve, okay? So everybody kind of understands that whole scenario. So when it's dry, we hold more. When it's wet, we don't. So yield loss typically tends to happen when we have this pull right here, and we can't exchange enough N to start covering this tick. Okay, so what we say is, hey, we go pull tissue test, hey, we're short in N here, so maybe we side dress somewhere in here to try to pull that up, right? Or if we get a wet year, that's gonna move that curve down. We get a dry year, we're gonna be able to hold that. So that's what we're doing. I've coined the term in corn, we try to play God. Okay, we know the future, we're trying to guess the future, we're looking at Farmer's Almanac, so we're trying to guess where that is. The problem is even in our field, we just took each field, we have spots that can hold nitrogen better, and we have spots that can hold as good. We have spots that yield better, and we have spots that don't. So we're putting out a baseline of nitrogen, trying to figure out the law of averages. Okay, that's what we're doing. So the guys that say, well, I don't want any spot in my field, I'm just gonna apply up here, right? So some of it gets to take advantage. Certain hybrids will really respond off from that. Your workhorses tend not to. So they don't want to leave any part of that field unchecked. They're going after everything. Not a real high ROI. The other side with this is in the spots that N was applied, but wasn't, let's just say it was never, this represents not utilized, and let's just say the yield potential was below. Does this make sense? Let's flip that. So here we put this out, and we could have responded, and the yield did not respond to that scenario. So in other words, this represents over-applying nitrogen. So there's a twofold negative ROI. Not only did I not get the return on my nitrogen dollar, what is excess N, these basal stockinase, what does that do to grain moisture? I gotta pay to dry it down now. And what happens here? So this is a -2 ROI. I over-applied N, I didn't see the yield, and I gotta pay to dry it down now. High moisture, high nitrogen in corn makes wet grain, guys. Okay? If I didn't get the grain, so let's say I had a spot that I over applied and the moisture and I did not get the bushel, right? Now I got another negative ROI because I over applied it. And what happened? I didn't get the yield for the amount of N. So that went up to 1.4, 1.5 units of N to try to get the same bushel. Here I was really efficient, but at the same time, the corn didn't respond to that excess N. So this is the profitabilities in your fields. Does that make sense? All right. I'm trying to do 3 hours and 7 minutes. All right. So,
Steve's timing it.
Steve's timing it. So I literally, I'll do this for 3 hours and I'll lay this out for people and we'll correlate it back to sulfur and nitrogen and the whole works. So what's really cool about what's hitting the marketplace with these things, guys, is they are doing something different. That's your root structure, here's your plant, right? This area around that root structure is affected by so many different things. Soil structure, soil type, fertilizer, moisture, lack of moisture, blood pressure, whatever it is. What we're trying to do is farm what we're breathing right now. Atmospheric nitrogen exists. Why don't we die? If I drank 28%, I'd die, right? Ammoniated and nitrated forms of nitrogen are different than the air that we're breathing. Does that make sense? All right. So the air has to be converted to ammoniated and nitrated forms for this plant to use it. So when we go and we used to cultivate, all right, the diffusion happens, oxygen goes in, CO2 goes out. When oxygen goes in, the little microbes down here, they will break that down into ammoniated and nitrated forms to feed the plant. That's why the corn will jump when we grab wood cultivate. Okay? All right. The key is converting. Okay? CO2, plant sucks it up, and away we go. All right. When you farm the air, we are trying to pull air in through the bottom side of the leaves. That's where it breathes, right? Okay. So what we want to do is utilize that air structure better. The bacteria that you're hearing about coming up, pivot bios, the Invitas, the Nutritions, the Terramaxes, that's what they're trying to accomplish. What they're doing, so I'm going to pick on Invita because right now we think that's the best one on the market. We've got access to all these. Pivot bio works by influencing and residing in the root structure. It will help sequester atmospheric nitrogen and convert it to ammoniated and nitrated forms. However, because it predominantly resides right here, it is still affected by all that. That's why you see such variable. It gets too dry, too wet. What's the first thing that shuts down? Root structure. This part keeps going. Okay? What makes methyls and GD bugs, Nutrition, Terrasims, and Vitas unique is they reside up here. So we're trying to take 76 to 78% nitrogen in our air and convert it into plant available forms of nitrogen. The plant's already doing this. The thing is, it sucks at it. It's horrible at it. Grandpa used to farm the air and the soil with a little bit of manure. Our genetics today say we need to supply fertilizer to keep up with the potential. Does that make sense? So we're not doing anything different that's already being done. We're just making it better. All right. So the idea to me, what separates these things out, is I got to get them up here, because now I don't care what happens down here. This can be too wet. This can be too dry. I can have rootworm pressure. I can have whatever happens down here happens. Once I get above the ground, atmospheric dews, everything, this part of the plant will survive. This part shuts down. The leaves are second to shut down. The stalk is the last thing. Corn dies in a plant on the outside from the bottom up, on the inside from the top down. That's the way it dies. This stalk is the last thing to feed the ear. When we run out of N or can't exchange N, when we get too dry, that's why we see N carryover. That's why those tests I'm saying are skewed. When we get too dry, there's plenty of N, but that's a bacterial process to get that into here. So when that shuts down, just like nodulation shuts down in soybeans, that process shuts down. It's trying to pull more atmospheric N in when it can't nodulate, when it can't exchange it in corn or wheat or whatever, okay? Same thing with alfalfa. So, what does that all lead to? I don't think I've ever done it 7 minutes, Steve. So what does it lead to? 6. That ain't gonna happen. So why do these things work so unique? What are these N reduction trials that you keep hearing? Cut your N back 30%, 10%. What does this equate to? In your field, I'm gonna use my brother, because the first studies we did with the Invita, so we've done it on Pivot Bio, Invita, Terramax, Nutrition, we've done it on all of them. Okay, looks weird. This is 300 bushel corn on my brother's. This is about 160. This is about 220. This is a wet spot. This runs about 220. There's a sand knoll that you can stand at 700, 800 John Deere non-front wheel assist with a 12-row Kinsey right up as you go over the top. Okay? All right. We did 2 trials out in his. This was a big eye-opener for me. The first time I saw this in 2019, we did 2 trials in a emission test. We took a whole field, static N application, ran 2 omission tests, meaning the rest of the field got treated, 2 strips didn't have it. I wanted to prove to see, hey, do these things actually work? So we come back, we take this trial out. We did 4 of them, North Dakota down to Wisconsin. Came back, there was 4 bushel, a point on test weight, and a point on dry down. I was like, eh. He was like, I doubled my money. I was like, not convinced. Comes back a couple weeks later and he goes, I picked up 14 bushel in that field. where 300 was still 300, that went to 200. This stayed about the same. That wet spot there went up. I don't remember exactly what it was. We looked at the field average. He said, I've never seen that field so consistent. Light bulb went off, okay? So what does that mean? When we look at N reduction with these things, what are we trying to do? We're farming the air. So what happens is in that plant, there's different modes of action for all the different ones that are in the countryside. And this is what key is to which ones work better than the others don't. I'm going to pick on Invita. Invita will actually populate into a plant. That individual bacteria multiplies over and over and over and infects every single cell, but it's natural. It dies off at the end of the year. But what it does is opens up in every cell an area to store more atmospheric air. Now that's one thing, but we know the plant sucks at converting it. That bacteria, when it's needed, will convert it to ammoniated and nitrated forms. But it's on demand. So in other words, when this system can't supply enough, this system takes over. Does that make sense, guys? That cannot supply enough based on a lack of N, leached N, I'm too dry. If I'm too wet, did I influence how much N is here? No, I don't have enough oxygen to exchange the N, it's a bacterial process, to feed it. That's why we get yellow corn when it's that tall. We just put 200 units out there. Do you think I don't have enough N? No, I don't have enough oxygen. Does that make sense? This system takes over.
How does it know? I mean, just,
It's a metabolic balance of hydrogen and diffusion with nitrogen. That's the plant's natural regulation method. So it will begin to actually diffuse off hydrogen and other gases to say, I need more atmospheric N because this system isn't working. Remember, this dies first, this dies second, this dies last. Okay? So, I'm not gonna make 7 minutes. So what these things are doing is, and I hate what Pivot Bio is doing, but I love the fact that they got $500 million with some very rich people out in Silicon Valley that dumped it in and made a $100 million marketing program because it's exposing how well these things can actually work in agriculture. But I'm going to tell you it isn't the most effective one because it lives down here on the inside, not on the outside, but nodulation. It's also why you can't use that product on soybeans because it has an adverse effect to the enzyme function that feeds the nodulation, or in other words, feeds the nitrogen fixating bacteria. That enzyme stimulates them and they'll come out and nodulate. If you have too much of that going on, it stops the enzyme function and it tells that soybean, I don't need to nodulate, thus I become lazy and I have to depend on this and that, 100%. That's why we can't put nitrogen on soybeans. It stops that function, okay? Because it says, I don't need to secrete that enzyme to get this thing going. So, but in grasses it'll work because they don't nodulate. But it's the least efficient place to have a microbial set on the inside of the plant, not the outside. That's why, to me, we gotta get up here. Because you get up here, none of this is influenced by that. So it's on demand. All right, so this is what's so cool, how these things are gonna change agriculture. Now, if you, I'm trying to do this as fast as I can, skip over a bunch of stuff. This is the way I look at N reduction. They're coming out and saying, you cut your N back 10, 30%. That's a scary thing, because if I'm on the low side, and I get a rain event, and I cut back 30%, and then I got that wet spot or the dry spots in my field, how much more did I go? So I use the coin phrase, how low can I go? But if we look at the economics, because you guys know me, I'm always back to, we have to manage soils and waters, but we also have to be able to farm. This is the cool part. The cool part, and this is the way we're presenting these things, no matter whose you buy, I'm presenting it this way. You have to figure out in your crop the variabilities in your field. And just like that 300 here, 160 here, remember that? I'm saying, what are you managing for? Are you managing for the absolute lowest spot, or are you managing for this? So when I showed you that test where they had 180 units at N, they applied an atmospheric fixating biology to it, and they picked up 4 bushel. That's what we see everywhere. If you're managing your N 0 to 4 bushel with these things, so how far can you go down? It depends on the variability and the insurance factor of how much rain do I typically tend to get. That's why it's so heavily influenced on how much rain do we get. The closer it is to planting, chances are the more I'm going to lose. The farther away from planting, chances are the less I'm going to use. So you have to gauge these things based on your farming practices, and that's what you said, Bob. Everybody's different, and that's what we say too. So you have to learn how to use these things, because the fact of the matter is, a GD bug will sequester atmospheric nitrogen and convert it to ammoniated nitrated forms all day long if you let it do it. Here's the thing. The data that's out there is based on whatever N application was applied to that test strip. And the number one rule, I don't care whose product you're using, if N is not a limiting factor, you will see nothing with any of them, because this system is never asked to work. Even if you didn't put it on, because it's got all it needs right there. So the plant never even goes to this secondary nitrogen system that's already built into it. What we're doing is asking this to do more, because the air we breathe is safe. That doesn't end up in your water. This does. Is you guys starting to see what I'm saying here? Okay, so.
And it's always better to have two options in anything.
It's the reserve program already built into every crop on the face of the earth. We just sit here and try to play God and don't allow it to do its job, because it's really bad at its job. What these things do is help it get better. That's what they do. So what we're asking to do is take atmospheric nitrogen. The key is to converting it. Not all bugs do it very well. That's why you have to differentiate all the different products, and where they reside is going to be a functionality of how well they're able to do their job. You get them in here, they're prone to all this. You get them up here, they're not prone to it. So when we start looking at N reduction, what I look at, remember the 0 to 4? This is my static line. I'm asking that thing in the best parts of my field to pick up that little 4. In the worst parts of my field, that's that 50 bushel on that N reduction, because I'm losing that already. So the question becomes, how low do I want to go? How much can I pull back where the variabilities in my field, something like this, can pick up? That to me is the N reduction. It's not just cut it all back and hope for the best, because if I get a big rain event, this whole bar now moves down to here, and I got to ask more of it here, and I got to ask a lot more of it out of here. You guys catching this? Okay, so that is where you have to start looking at these things and saying, and that's why the flat guys field that looks almost static across, I grew up in western Minnesota where we didn't have a lot of variability in fields. If it was wet, it was wet. If it was dry, it was a dry field. That's the way it was. But around here, it's a little bit different. So we've got this variability. So you have to look at your farm and say, on my yield maps, how much of it is. The N reduction is to show the capability of what certain biological strains can utilize that atmospheric N to pull that yield back up to statitize those fields. And here's the cool part. All that insurance N that's being put out there, you can't lose atmospheric N. You'd have to suck all the air out of the face of the earth. And this N will not end up in our water table.
I have a question.
Does this make sense? That was probably like 20.
What percentage of the corn plant's N can come from above?
It's really genetic, but that's what the N reduction test. By itself, it's really poor at doing it. Same thing with soybeans. So soybeans is the same situation. If I got a soybean plant here, right, and this system is influenced by so many different things, too wet, too dry, cyst nematodes, all these things. Anything that starts to stop nodulation. So when we get into the dry months, this system shuts down because it takes moisture for that enzyme function to keep that system going. So that's why we see variability. We did tests down in Iowa where we treated individual fields in different conditions, and we saw the statitized yields come back because, again, when this system shuts down, this system was coming in. So people say, well, why don't I put this on my soybeans? Same thing is happening. It's just here, it's doing it naturally. On a corn plant, we're trying to play God. We're trying to put it out and guess. This system is self-regulating. It's just horrible when this system shuts down at getting this system to kick in. It's happening, just to what degree, and it's very minimal because atmospheric N is not converted real easy in the plant. what these biologies that you're hearing about, they will do that for you. Now, there's a law of diminishing returns. That's why when you look at the N reduction test and all these things, after you hit a certain threshold and you stress that plant too much for N, that whole physiological balance of that plant changes. It goes into survival mode. It's not worried about producing you 300 bushel of corn. All it wants to do is produce one seed, because it wants to go reproductive when it switches to vegetative. As long as it can kick out one kid, that's all it cares. So it will do that, and that's too much stress. So that's that fine line, how much you can ask out of something like this. To me, that's what the N reduction tests are. So in essence, what we're trying to do is farm the air better, because the plant is already trying to do it. We're just helping it do it. Thus, if our N static line, even if we're variable rating, you still have the same fluctuations. You still are susceptible to rain problems. So there's three coin things. It's insurance, because I can't lose that nitrogen. It's in the plant, and I got a bug that's physically creating a bigger storehouse and digesting it. Two is statitizing. We're looking at taking the yield potential and trying to bring it all up. How much can we ask out of it? And the big thing, the next big thing, is it's a regulator. See, even certain hybrids, we might put 180 units out. Every hybrid, there's actually a test we did in Wisconsin, and right next door to each other, 180 units of N. A particular response off from one of the hybrids was 25, almost 30 bushel more, because that hybrid actually wanted more N. And then we threw a workhorse next to it, and guess what? It was 4, 0 to 4, 0 to 4, right? He was fertilizing. He could have got a response out from it. So these things made the difference up atmospherically instead of having to apply more. So that regulator is basically saying, even in soybeans, excess nitrogen production in soybeans, when we over-nodulate, we don't have enough sulfur to capture that and hold that in the plant, make a complete amino acid, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, all right? It'll hold that N in. So it takes advantage of it. That's what sulfur does. So when that plant wants more nitrogen to produce a bigger bean or more pods, if it can't store it, it'll gas it off. That's insects, that's disease, that's wet grain, that's what's causing that. So that's why sulfur is so important. But the regulation aspect of how these things work is they will never produce more N than what the plant actually wants. Because as soon as that stops, as soon as the plant says my N need is full, if we supply it down here in luxury feed, just like he said, it'll just take it up, not even use it, gas it off, and that's our insects and diseases. But doing it naturally, it steps off the gas. Because again, the metabolic balance that wants to pull that in says, I don't need any more, I'm done. So I will not overproduce N, thus I don't have to worry about that double negative ROI and dry it back down. It's a regulator, because it stops.
I think a good point you can correlate it to, Josh, is, you know, the grid sampling. You're trying to even out your whole field, you know.
It's the statitizing.
And you're,
And you're asking this to make up the variability without having to over-apply. It will never apply more than what it actually needs.
Yep.
It just backs back off, because again, we're doing it differently.
Yeah.
And to me, the
But
best products have to get out of the ground.
But on your, you know, you had your 300 bushel, 150 bushel areas in the field. With our grid sampling and our variable rate, we're trying to equalize the whole field, and that's what these products are doing.
It is, yeah. And so, but even like even with your variable rate, you're still going to want to go up because it has greater potential there, but you still find that threshold.
Yeah.
And then you also have the insurance factor, just because if I went up to match the yield potential, if I get a rain event, I now went down here. This thing is saying, that's fine, you get a little bit of a rain event, I'll make it back up for you. How much can we ask of it? And to me, you got to go after the ones that are above ground, because they do not have the effect. This is why Pivot Bio's data is all over. It's also why, like the Beck's PFRs with some of these things, some showed results, some didn't. Well, what do? In most trial scenarios, they make sure N is an limiting factor. They dump a lot of N on because they don't want that to skew what's happening. Well, none of them work if N is a limiting factor, because they metabolically just don't even go into that phase of pulling in atmospheric N because we've oversupplied it in the root structure. So N has to be a limiting factor. That's the number one rule. So we collectively pull that down. We look at the variability in the field. We ask how much can these make up that difference. That is that 10 to 30%. If you're already at a 0.7 or 0.8, when you get a rain event, you're going to be way down here. You're going to be in that stress zone where that's going to change that balance. But if you're at that 1 to 2, or you're side dressing and you're trying to maintain that, you could start to look at pulling down, and then how much will that ask out of that variability, and how much will it ask if we get these rain events? That's the top 20% of N coming out of our water table, and that N doesn't affect it. That's why I'm so excited about these things.
And what are they called again? What's like the product group called?
There's 3 big ones on the market right now, and we've evaluated. There's actually about 6 of them. 3 of them kind of have the most traction. And then there's ones that try to claim they work like other ones, but they don't, like Source. Okay, that actually is a stimulant for existing bacteria. But the 3 big ones on the market right now are Invita, Pivot Bio, and Blue N. Your dad used Blue N. It's now called Nutrition. Corteva bought the rights to that in the States. They all work differently.
And they're all like a biologic.
They're all biologicals. Pivot Bio is GMO. So what Pivot Bio did, you can't patent a bug, but you can patent a process. And you don't invent a bug, you find a bug. So there's a lot of bugs that have been around a long time that have done this. So what Pivot Bio did, this is just my interpretation, is they took a set of bugs, just like they did with Roundup corn, and they said, hey, we're gonna alter that bug, genetically modified. So they changed the DNA in that bug, and they claimed an efficiency. So when Roundup Ready 2 came out, all they did was took a gene marker that used to sit right here, and they moved it to here, claimed an efficiency, and now they had a new patent, because that patent was expired. That's why you're gonna see FBN take on the original Roundup Ready patent, because it's expired. This is Roundup Ready 2. That's what they did. They took a set of biology that already exists, because again, you don't invent a bug, you find a bug, altered the DNA. Anybody here gonna prove a $500 million company wrong that they didn't make that bug more powerful? I don't have it, nobody's got it, nobody in the marketplace can do it. So they could make a claim and now patent it, but they had to go through a GMO process, genetically modified their DNA to make that claim. They put multiple strains in, multiple modes of action, went out, and in good conditions, it will do exactly what they say it does. And then you have to ask it to what extent. Their problem is, and they even say this right on their website, is it predominantly resides on the inside of the root structure. And that is why when you look at Pivot Bio's research, anytime they fall off from 2 normal, they start having problems. Even the Pivot Bio guys come to us and say, explain to us why this is. I said, because you guys sit down here. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't go up in here, but this is the factory. So when this shuts down, this shuts down. So in a good year, Pivot Bio works. It's when we fall off from normal, or we have root structure issues, they shut down. That's why we threw them out. That's the one company we won't work with, because I'm trying to get up there, okay? Methyls, like the one your dad used, methyls tend to reside here. We've got multiple strains of methyls that we use. They tend to locate in the leaf structure. So when you foiler, you have to foiler that one on. They have to migrate to the bottom side of the leaf, go into the stomata. That one, if you get one bacteria in that plant, it will begin to repopulate. And Vita predominantly resides in the stalk. This is why we think we see the best results. It's the cheapest one, but it's the best results, because the stalk is the last thing to cannibalize itself. So this is another strike against Pivot Bio. What happens when I get anthracnose? We route the stalk off right there. Do you think you think it can work now? It's trying to feed the ear. Methyls. I like methyls better than this, way better, and we got several of them. What happens if I get a hail event? I shatter that. Leaf disease. Why are we spraying fungicides? Leaf disease begins to diminish that factory. And we're trying to typically, on that scale, we've got if this is tassel, harvest plant, we've usually got a yield drag right in here, and if we start running out of N, this is what we're trying to hold on to. This is why we over apply here to try to get that curve farther out. Okay, so yield drag. We're usually pretty good right up in here. Okay, so that's why we think this one is working the best, because it's the last thing to cannibalize itself. Too much for you?
No, yeah, we're good.
Good?
Thanks.
Yep, all right. So I hope you guys can, that is, so
You
we
use
go
the
out and
word-
test all this stuff. We don't care who it comes from. We try to figure out which ones are working the best. And that's why we're so excited about it.
When you use the word bug, you're referring to bacteria?
But yes, bacteria. So the methyls that are out there, there's different strains of methyls. So it's kind of like saying Ford, Chevy, Dodge. They all have idiosyncrasies, and some of them, you could look at it like a half-ton pickup versus a Duramac diesel. They're pickups, but which one's going to do the job? So the other thing that I explain to people is there's a lot of companies, even inside of our company, we refuse to sign exclusives or minimums so that we're not branded with anybody. We go after what we think is working. We'll get another company that'll come and say, well, ours is just as good as that. We have 5 different strains. And I'll say, if I got a loaded semi trailer with cattle and I need to get it to Kansas City and I got 5 half-ton pickups, or I got a Peterbilt, which one do I want? I want the big dog. If I gotta go make line fences and I got 5 half-ton pickups and 5 guys, that might be a scenario to use it. It makes no difference. It comes down to the end result. It's not about quantity, it's about how good it can get the job done. So we even argue amongst different companies that come at us and say evaluate our product. We'll say it doesn't, just because you have more doesn't mean it makes it better. One strain can do the job way better than 5. And in some cases, 5 modes of action is better than 1. And stock degraders and things like that, oftentimes different strains are more beneficial. So you have to really understand the biologicals and how they work. Some methyls work stronger than other methyls. This GD bug that's found in the Invita is completely different than what was in the Blue N that we got your dad, right? The GD bug is a stronger bug, but that Blue N was the only one that was Omni listed, so we had to go with that, which is stronger than other methyls that we know. Now Invita is going to be organic next year, and that's the one we're kind of saying, hey guys, it's the cheapest one in the market. It's in, if you want to know, it's the least amount of incentive for the person selling it. Trust me, I know. And but it's the strongest one. And so we don't care. Put it all in a brown paper bag or a box. It comes down to how effective are they. So it's a, and if you want to know, the GD bug that's found in Invita came out of sugarcane in Asia. It was a survival technique that it had to grow in those types of environments. They found it 30 years ago. Europe's been doing it for years. They just finally made it to the States. Why do I think a lot of these got pushed off in the States? The ag sector is 42% of petroleum. Nitrogen is 89% of that 42%. Do you think there's a few lobbyists in the petroleum industry and Congress to maybe stop a few things coming in through the FDA and EPA? Probably. All right, Pivot Bio was a knee-jerk reaction knowing that other parts of the world were already doing this. It was very, very common. And they said, whoa, there's new things coming in. You don't invent a bug, you find a bug. Right? You can't patent the bug, you have to patent the process. So if we change the DNA and we now have a process, we can patent it. We can take old strains, put it in a jug, put it under good growing conditions, show a response, just like Aspergillium and Azos that have been around in the States for years and years, and go sell something. Because they knew these things are coming. So that probably took 20 minutes. But that's still pretty good for about 3 hours. Because we go in depth and I'll show the specific modes of action and all these different things when we do these talks. And we don't care who it comes from. We just evaluate all these things on the market and figure out which ones we think are working better. We team up with the manufacturers and say, look, we're not going to be exclusive to you. We're not going to sign bias things. We're not going to have to sell so much. I don't care if we sell 1 or 100. I got $2 million worth of Invita sitting in St. Charles right now. That's the largest supply in the world right now. And sitting in St. Charles. And the reality of it is that that's all done under us. It's not because we signed some contract. It's because we've said this is the one that's working the best. This is the one we're going to go talk to ag retailers about. We still have the other ones if they're interested. We'll put side by sides. We actually took a methyl last year and hooked it with a GD up by Plainview, and we start trying to play with different companies and putting them together to see what works. Company 5, product 7, company 10, product 2. Hey, there might be some synergy here. We'll hook them together, and because we're not biased to them, we can do that, and they can't stop us. We grew soybeans so tall last year, they all lodged. We said, oh, that doesn't work. Right? Now we know the yield was there, we're just gonna get it off the ground. So how do we combat that? So that's the stuff that we get into. So I'm not making a plug for any particular one. I'm just being very honest and saying, hey, this is what's gonna change. And this is why I believe these things will be on every acre in the United States, organic and conventional, within 10 years. Because they are going to change the industry. And we're doing it with phosphorus stabilizers, we're doing it with potassiums, we're doing it with all sorts of really neat, inexpensive things that will have a positive impact on the soils, on the environment, the ROIs. I mean, whoever thought overhead application you were paying to dry your corn down? Anybody ever even think of that? Nobody thinks of it. But it's happening on your farm constantly. And that's why you gotta find that threshold and figure out where to land in there. So we're educating farmers and saying, and it, predominantly in my business now, it's retailers that are going out to the farmers, because we just can't get to all the farmers, but we can have a bigger influence through the retailers. That's why I started GrowSource the way I did, because we needed to get, there's so much more. This is just one of hundreds of things we talk about, but that's what we're trying to get out there. So, is to educate people about these things. So, sorry, took a little longer. I thought I did pretty good, but
We still have agency reports to do.
yep. So anyway, so it's really exciting. Okay, agency reports.
I've got some updates.
Okay.
Good job, Josh. Round of applause for your presentation.
That wasn't a prize, just talking really fast.
So I'm Emily with MPCA. So some updates I have. As Sheila and Jeff noted, the Whitewater 319 grant is ending in September this year. It began back in 2018, about $232,000 into this watershed for all that good work. So I just wanted to say kudos to this board for supporting that, and I think it would be a really nice idea towards the end of the year, maybe we can have a presentation about the overall, products of the grant, that sort of thing. I would be happy to come in and team up with Sheila or whomever. I don't know if we need to have Jeff come back again, but just something to think about. It'd be nice to kind of tie a ribbon on that grant after it being in effect for the years that it has. The second thing I have is some monitoring updates. So, okay, MPCA goes into every watershed in the state once every 10 years, and then we sample for water chemistry, which is what Winona County did with their SWAY grant. But then MPCA staff collect fish and bugs, and we do that once every 10 years. So we went back and revisited this area last year and the year before. We need one more year to finish up our fish and bug sampling because of the drought conditions that we had last year. We went to site and we're like, this is not representative. We don't want to, collect the fish and the bugs.
And
the score would be weird.
Bugs to you are bugs.
Bugs to me are bugs. Yep, macroinvertebrates that live in the stream. Thanks, Steve. Yep,
Ones you
not
can see,
bacteria.
right? Ones you can
Right,
see.
ones you can see.
There you go.
So anyway, long story short, we will be doing our assessment of that data that we collected next year about this time. So it'll be interesting to compare the data that we collected in these last 3 years to what we did back in 2010 and see if our waters are getting better, worse, which ones those are, that sort of thing. The other things I have, just to kind of clarify some things that were said earlier this morning. So Josh had brought up the chloride monitoring, and that is something that we'll probably be finishing up in April this spring. And the sites that we had selected throughout the WinLAC, which is the Miss River, Winona, and La Crescent watersheds, we tried to focus in on road crossings where there'd be a lot of salt application, and then also areas where it would be easy access, but also kind of close to a wastewater treatment plant discharge, because water softeners are also a source of chloride. And so we were thinking, well, maybe we could pick something up. So we don't really know what we're gonna find. We did one round of monitoring so far. Preliminarily looking at the data, chloride levels were very low, but we have a couple more visits. So if you guys want me to, I'd be happy to come back like maybe June, July, August, and can show you the data that we collected and just see what it looks like.
What about like dust control on the township roads where they spray chloride solutions and things?
Right, and that's in the summertime. We're not really, monitoring for chloride in the summer.
I think that's minimal compared to salt application.
Oh,
in the
absolutely,
winter.
yeah.
Right.
And you
Yeah.
can see along the roads, I've seen it where the grass is burnt brown for some time just from the, snowplow plowing the salt off.
Right, yeah.
This year's been very easy though, because we haven't had a lot of intermittent snow events that
Mhm.
continually require salt. So.
Right. So yeah, keep that in mind. I'd be happy to come back and just kind of share the data with you guys. We can all kind of take a look at it. And then the last thing I wanted to clarify is Steve's comment about watershed boundaries being a new level of government. And I just wanted to clarify that it's not. It's not a new added level of government, that the state of Minnesota, any kind of watershed related work, we've been organizing our boundaries by watershed since 2007. And I wanted to apologize directly about the feelings or maybe any kind of animosity that I created from shifting to Wabasha. But the whole point of these state funds is to do the work that the citizens and local governments are concerned about. And I think that those grants and those dollars are an awesome opportunity for us to work together. And that's part of my job, is to get, those grants into the local hands so that we can do that important work. But, I'm sorry that it didn't work out with Winona. I wish that it had, but I'm happy that we're able to still continue to do that work. And I look forward to working with Winona in the future too. So feel free to, talk with me directly about any of those concerns that any of you guys have about the state funding and how we do our work. I'm happy to talk to you guys about that. But those are all the updates that I have, and yeah.
I'll just respectfully disagree with you.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion? Anything else?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Moved and made. Second?
Second.
Steve and Bob. Bob beats you to it. Sorry, Gene. All those in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Meeting adjourned. Sheila, do I have